And you talk about your mother when you were in college. She did translating for you and she did some of the activism with you guys, you and your sister.
Right. So my mother was fairly unusual. She did talk about the camps, which a lot of the former inmates never did. They wanted to put it behind them, and kind of like men who go to war and they see and do things that they, don't want to remember. And but my mother did talk about it, and uh, she she also made a great effort to speak English without an accent, and she was fully bilingual. And so my younger sister, who was born in Denver, and I were political activists, and my mother joined in as well. This was in the, let me see, probably 1970s. Um, we joined a couple of national groups. One was called the Pacific Asian Coalition, and the other was called the Asian American um, Mental Health Research Center. And that was just because the grants that funded those programs came from the NIMH, then called NIMH, National Institute for Mental Health. Now it's just NIH. And it allowed us to organize across the country. My mother and I represented a region that included Denver and Colorado, and we traveled all over, organized on a national basis, uh, did did things that even included doing studies on the Vietnamese boat people who came over at the end of the Vietnam War. But we also tried to look into mental health issues that had occurred because of our traumatic displacement during World War II. And in much the same way that the uh, Central American children have been separated from their families and traumatized, that we suffered from traumas that are still today being discovered in a sense, because we had repressed those memories, and because, as they say, the history is told by the victor. So it's was a long time before we were able to investigate and write our own history from um, what we knew happened to us, and not from the lies that the U.S. government wanted to put forth in terms of why we were incarcerated.
And you say that this has been going on also with African Americans with slavery and also with like Mexican Americans, well, all foreigners coming in from other countries. This
Right. So,
trauma, historical trauma.
right. That the killings of the 6 Asian women in Atlanta really brought it forward again. The centuries long uh, uh, descriptions of and beliefs about Asian women, and uh, but it's that nothing is new in terms of uh, that treatment of us, that it's happened to so many different ethnic groups, um, you know, from the indigenous who were forced off of their land, separated from their families, forced to cut their hair and stop speaking their language, and assimilate, uh, the separation of those children who were born into slavery when their parents were sold off to a different plantation, the constant destruction of any businesses or communities that African Americans were able to pull together after slavery ended. And we know that there have been continuous efforts to keep people of color in their place. The voting impediments in Georgia is a clear example of that. The immigration patterns of those from the South, often pushed by climate change and problems in their home countries, by things like trading sanctions. For instance, the corn production in the U.S. is subsidized, and driving Mexican farmers out of business. And if you can't make a living there, you're forced to go somewhere else in order to send money back and support your families. And so it's travesty upon travesty upon travesty. And the fact that today the right wingers seem to have no shame in terms of doing things like applying sanctions against voting by people of color, that they blatantly put forward those kinds of laws even today, means that we've really made hardly any progress at all, and that we have to keep fighting for our place. And we shouldn't have to still be fighting in this day and age.
Can you talk about your experience or how your experience influenced you today? Influenced your work today?
It's been a long struggle, and it hasn't ended. My radicalism has made me, I guess, what you would call a black sheep in the community, but it rarely deterred me from what I felt I needed to do in terms of trying to bring some justice into this country. And in a way, where I grew up in Five Points here in Denver, which is the ghetto of Denver, gave me lifelong friends. That I may have mentioned that Manual High School, we called ourselves the Little United Nations, and even today, I have friends from 50 years, 60 years ago, those who were in the Black Panther Party, the Black Panther Party for self-defense. That there's a clear issue where the U.S. government destroyed an organization that was only trying to help its people. One of the things that I have tried to say to people along the way is that you always have to know what the enemy is doing, so that you can try and circumvent it. So you need to learn their tactics, and so that you can avoid them or circumvent them. I've used those lifelong friendships to learn and lead me in the right direction, or what I consider the right direction, to keep fighting, to build alliances. One of the things that I think is really important is communication, and it's why I've co-produced a radio show, La Lucha Sigue, for more than 30 years. So my husband and I bring to the airwaves news on Latin America and the Caribbean that is not found in the mainstream press. We don't want people to forget about the United States continues to do. I traveled to Nicaragua back in the 1980s in order to speak with Nicaraguans, mostly women, about what the revolution in 1979 meant to them and how it had changed their lives. I've worked on the Navajo reservation, trying to make a difference in terms of the strip mining of coal by Peabody Corporation. Of course, there's the uranium mining that took place there. Oh, and right now I'm working with CIRC, the Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition, because legislation is another way to try and make a difference, try and change the laws. But communication, I think, is really the important thing. So to learn as much as you can, and then try to put into effect different policies that will actually make a difference. Of course, the right wing is always out there lurking and trying to subvert the kinds of laws that we put in place to make it easier to vote, to make things more equitable for equal pay, all of the things that are important to the real freedoms that all of us need in order to not only just to survive but to bloom.
I have a question from a student. They asked about your work on immigration and helping Japanese Americans gain citizenship status.
So my father emigrated to the United States back in the 1920s, the late 1920s. He could not even apply for U.S. citizenship until 1952, well after World War II ended. And there was a piece of legislation called the McCarran-Walter Act. And after that passed, he was able to apply for U.S. citizenship, and he did so as soon as he was able. And I went to his swearing-in ceremony, and he said that it was one of the happiest days of his life. Now, the Walter McCarran Act had some other bad provisions in it. I had an email exchange with Rudy Acuna, who pointed that out to me. So, when I was saying you need to constantly to learn, that's just an example of that. Gaining citizenship it's not all that it's cracked up to be. 2/3 of the 120,000 of us Japanese who were put into the concentration camps were U.S. citizens, and that didn't prevent our imprisonment, our loss of everything material, and including up to and including our constitutional rights. So it does, however, afford some protections, or at least right now it does. Who knows what the right wing might be up to that would keep some of us from having all of the rights that we should have under the Constitution. So there's always work to be done. You need to outfox them.
Okay, and I think it's about time to start wrapping it up. So, is there anything else you would like to add? What's the radio station that you work on?
It's KGNU 88.5 FM. We have 2 studios, one in Boulder and one in Denver. We have 1390 AM in Denver.
Oh, okay.
And of course, you can get it online. So let me just say one last thing.
Oh, okay.
This is about the so-called reparations that the Japanese Americans were supposed to have received back in the 1980s. It was really a sham, because there were some radical Asians, including me, participated in what was called a class action suit. So if you're an aggrieved group of people, you can file in court. But we were such neophytes, we were so new to the process that we filed in the wrong court and we were turned back on a technicality. If we had had our day in court, we could have proven our losses and we could have gotten for our community much more than the pittance of money that was given through the so-called governmental reparations. The U.S. government knew that we had filed this class action suit, so they rushed through a congressional approach, and it was worthless. They gave us a worthless presidential apology because the U.S. government has continued to do the very same kinds of things that they did to us, just to other populations. And with the African Americans who are now looking for compensation and reparations, I think they have to be very careful in terms of not being subverted by the government and agreeing to less and less and less, because that's what the government will do. But my main point that I wanted to make about the so-called reparations is that it was a dividing tactic by the U.S. government to put Asians in general and Japanese in particular into this position in between them and so we're like this buffer between people of color and the ruling class. So they, what the U.S. government wanted to do was so that they could say, why can't you people, other people of color, pull yourselves up by the bootstraps like Japanese Americans did? And it's just another tactic by the U.S. government. They didn't mean it when they were sorry, because they've continued to use the very same process against others, and they wanted us to get as little as possible, but still get the benefits of being able to pat themselves on the back and to say that they did the right thing. So we, as people of color, have to be very careful about the motives of the U.S. government as we go forward in our struggle. And thanks very much for having me on this interview.